It's a bit ironic. I come from the International Food Policy Research Institute. This is an international development organization in Washington, and we focus predominantly on kind of rural development and rural food security. So it's a little ironic that I'm talking today about urbanization in Africa. But urbanization has really been a topic that I've worked on from different angles over the last 5 to 8 years or so. And it's, of course, a huge topic. And so in the next 40 minutes or so, I'm not going to be able to cover every dimension of urbanization, but hopefully touch on some important aspects, and particularly look at the intersection between urbanization, democratization, and decentralization in Africa. These are 3 ongoing trends within the region to different degrees across the region, but they're intersecting in quite interesting ways. So I think first, we should take a step back and think about why we even care about urbanization in Africa. And it's really because of the facts that are out there regarding this process. We know from projections that by 2030, Africa is predicted to be an urban continent, that a majority of citizens will be living in urban areas. And by mid-century, it's believed that the urban population in Africa will triple. 20% of the world's urban population will be in Africa. But of course, this creates some huge service delivery issues in terms of sanitation, electricity, water provision, and housing as well. And so it's creating some really urgent challenges for African governments. In addition, we're seeing African cities as really bringing in very different socioeconomic constituencies. Many are characterized by a small elite, a small but definitely growing middle class, and a predominantly large urban poor, which is also quite young. So we know Africa is kind of the youngest continent, has this kind of large youth bulge that we hear a lot about in the media, and about 50% of Africans are 20 years old or younger. And when you see the kind of median age of Africans, it's actually lower in urban areas than even in rural areas in Africa. So you have this kind of confluence of these different demographic and socioeconomic groups in the city, which makes it very interesting dynamics to be studying. Decentralization, which has really progressed in fits and starts across the region, sometimes complicates the institutional environment in cities. So you often have mayors, you may have governors, you may have provincial leaders, as well as ministries of urban development or ministries of local government as well, all kind of involved in the urban space, and all having different responsibilities for service delivery. And so sometimes this complicates the processes of accountability for citizens because they're not really sure who amongst these various actors to hold responsible for service delivery. And then when you add democratization on top of these other processes, we'll see later in the lecture how democratization sometimes complicates service delivery by encouraging kind of inter-party competition over which political party can provide these services. So I think it's important if we just take a step back and think about terminology around this topic of urbanization. And the 2 terms you've probably heard a lot about is the urbanization rate and the urbanization level. But they're quite different in what they're actually capturing. So the urbanization rate is the speed at which the national population is increasing in cities and towns. And within Africa, East Africa is the subregion that has the fastest urbanization rate. So it's about 4% per year, and that's supposed to hold up for about the next decade. By contrast, Southern Africa is about 1.8% per year, so it has a lower urbanization rate, and that's on par with about the global urbanization rate. On the other hand, you have the urbanization level, and this is the share of the national population living in cities and towns. So even though Southern Africa has the lowest urbanization rate in Africa, it's the subregion that has the highest urbanization level, right? You have about 50, 60, 65% of your population in countries like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, living in cities. Then you might hear in the media talk about mega cities. And this is actually kind of distinct category of cities. You have to have at least a minimum population of 10 million people to qualify as a mega city. A primate city contains at least twice the population of the country's second largest city. And when we look across the region, this problem of primacy is more pronounced in some countries than in others. So if you think of Senegal and Dakar, Dakar is a little bit over 2 million people, and the second biggest city is about 400,000 people. And so you have many people who are urbanizing, they're coming to one city in particular. Very different than what you might find in Ghana, where you've got an Accra and a Kumasi that are relatively equivalent, or South Africa, where you have a number of cities, Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban, that are about equivalent sizes. And then finally, you have this concept of secondary city. This is a topic that's getting a lot of traction within the donor community and by governments as well that are interested in kind of reducing the problem of primacy. And this typically refers to having a population of at least 100,000 people and does not include the country's largest city. Just to complicate things, we don't really have a consistent definition of what's urban across many of the countries in the region. And this is just a sample to give you an idea drawn from the UN Demographic Yearbook about how different countries in the region define what is urban. So you can see three levels of definitions. The most basic is the actual number of people, and that varies wildly. So if you have 2,000 inhabitants in Ethiopia, you're urban. If you have 10,000 in Senegal, you're urban. The second level of distinction is the kind of economic activity, right? So places like Botswana, Zambia, they also claim, a majority of your activities cannot be in the agricultural sector to be classified as urban. And then a kind of final category is the administrative category. And Burkina Faso is an example of this. So if you're an administrative center, if you're the provincial capital, for example, you're de facto urban. When you look at this, one of the main issues is this really complicates research on urbanization globally, because this is actually a problem you face globally, these different definitions. But really encourages us to be cautious when we talk about urbanization trends in the region. This is just to give you kind of a visual sense of some of the trends I already mentioned. When we look in the African continent here, you can see some of the trends I was mentioning. So the kind of yellow dots in southern Africa kind of show just a small, 1 to 3% urbanization rate. You see these orange dots in East and West Africa, the 3 to 5% growth rate. And then notably, you see these squares in our two kind of mega cities in sub-Saharan Africa, in Kinshasa and in Lagos, with Cairo being the other main mega city on the continent. And then this again is highlighting the trends I mentioned, just going back to kind of the urbanization level rather than the rate. To give you that sense that we have a lot of our green in East and part of the kind of southeastern Africa. And these are the projections to 2030, so kind of what will urbanization levels look like in 2030 in the region. So some of our, Botswana, South Africa, having about 60 to 80% population being urban. So of course, when you have so many people kind of concentrated increasingly in the same spot, you have a real challenge for service delivery. And the major issue is a lot of African cities were not designed for the population pressures that they're currently facing. So if we take Lusaka, for example, the capital of Zambia, it was originally designed to house 125,000 people, and it now has about 2.6 million people. And so you have very outdated zoning laws, cadastral surveys, very weak land rights. And all of this contributes to some of the landscape that you see in many cities where you may have kind of large slum growth in a particular part of the city. We know from UN Habitat that about 60% of Africa's urbanites live in slums. Some of these slums are actually considered illegal because they're on government-owned land. So the famous Kibera that we hear about in Kenya is actually considered illegal. And when you're illegal, you're not actually entitled to certain government services. So it's a bit ironic. These slums will be zoned for elections. You'll have polling stations in them, but they're not actually, authorized to get certain government services. One of the reasons you have such a challenge with service delivery is that many municipal governments in Africa do not have sufficient own-generated finance. And this is, of course, a challenge that's even larger in rural areas, which have even a smaller income base. But we do see across the region, very few cities that are kind of financially solvent in their own right. One reason for this is because of very low property taxes. hindered by what I just mentioned. If you have a lot of people in informal housing or with weak land rights, you can't actually levy property taxes. Another reason is because if you have a huge share of your population in the informal economy, and it's estimated by the ILO that about 72% of the urban African labor force is in the informal economy. And so even though these people they're actually being taxed quite a bit in terms of levies to sell in marketplaces or on the street, but the state can't really capture sufficient income taxes from this constituency. And so all of these issues together really hinder municipal governments from having their own revenue and create a huge dependence on central government transfers. This is just taking Gini coefficients and looking at the national Gini coefficient versus the kind of city Gini coefficient. For those of you who aren't familiar with this term, a Gini coefficient is kind of the basic measure of inequality, ranging from 0 to 1. And if country's a 0, it's kind of completely equal. If it's a 1, extremely unequal. One person holds all the wealth. And so if you are higher on the scale, then you're more unequal. And so what you can see is the cities are highlighted in black here, and the countries that they correspond to in gray. And so cities like Abidjan, Lagos, Nairobi, Addis, all of these cities have a higher level of inequality than you're seeing nationally. And there's some visible ways in which you can see this inequality. One way is in the kind of aspirations that governments may have for their cities in Africa. And there's this trend for many national governments wanting kind of world-class cities rather than really investing in improving the infrastructure and services in current ones. One example is this vision of Eco-Atlantic in Lagos in Nigeria. You can kind of see this is kind of an artist rendering of what this is going to look like. They've been working on this for a long time. Another is in Kinshasa. It's kind of La Cité du Fleuve. Both of these are kind of integrated, kind of leisure, office, and kind of work residential areas. But of course, they'll be priced, way above what many urban Africans are able to afford. And so this kind of fits what one sociologist, David McDonald, calls obsession with kind of world-class city syndrome, that you want to kind of create something clean, new, really modern, rather than kind of addressing existing service delivery issues. You see very much an emphasis on flagship housing projects that are often unaffordable by most urban residents. A great example is in Angola, not far outside of the capital of Luanda. The Chinese helped to build something called the new city of Colombo, and this was supposed to provide about 500,000 housing settlements, had kind of a stadium, hospitals, etc. And it was just priced too high. It became kind of a ghost town because many people couldn't actually afford to live there. And you hear cases of this many places in the continent. And so in some ways, governments are in particularly urban city governments, are facing this tension increasingly between trying to reconcile these different constituencies that they encounter in the cities, between kind of maintaining law and order and cleanliness for their wealthier citizens versus mobilizing votes of the urban poor who don't have the resources, but certainly they have the numerical weight for elections. And there's kind of no area that kind of manifests this trend as clearly as when you look at the informal sector in urban areas. This is a topic I'm working on quite a bit now. You have a number of urban governments a number of national governments, I should say, who have these periodic crackdowns on the urban poor, who, as I mentioned earlier, are predominantly concentrated in the informal sector, either demolishing their shacks or their tables or their kiosks where they're selling, having task force that kind of, actually arrest people and fine them for selling on the streets. And if you look at some of the examples of the names of these campaigns, Operation Order, Zero Tolerance, Clean Sweep. Most recently in January in Nairobi, they had this Operation Sweep. And they're all based around this concept of law and order or of cleanliness. But what's notable is we've been seeing a trend in this harassment over time, and this data comes from the Armed Conflict database, which is based out of Austin, Texas. we've been seeing this trend in growing harassment over time. But what's notable is that if you look at kind of monthly data, you'll see that this stops around electoral periods, right? Because obviously, if you're going to be throwing the poor off the street around elections, you're not going to get their votes. So I want to then kind of turn now to what some of these dynamics about urbanization and the service delivery issues that it engenders. What are the implications first for democratization? And we can look at this from three perspectives. The first is on voting in elections. Now, the conventional wisdom that's out there is that urbanization is really associated with the growth in the middle class, and the middle class, in turn, will press for greater democratization. We're not exactly seeing this yet in the African context, and this could just be because we still have a relatively small middle class in the region. There is a kind of Journal of International Development special issue on Africa's middle class from 2015 that looks at some of these issues in more detail. And finding, on the one hand, of course, urban Africans are more educated, they're more engaged in the news, they know what's going on. They're also more distrustful of existing institutions. And this comes from a lot of the Afrobarometer public opinion data. On the other hand, many of them have their own private security guards, their own generators, their kids are in private schools, and so they don't have that same type of social contract with the state that particularly the poor have. So they're not really often pushing for better services all the time, as they're somewhat divorced from a heavy reliance on the public sector in the same way that some of the urban poor may be. So, but it's still a topic that's really underdeveloped, and I think as we see the middle class growing even more in the next decade or so, this is a topic that needs more investigation. A second element of this dimension on voting in elections is this idea of the salience of ethnicity. The conventional wisdom is really that ethnicity becomes more muted as people move into urban settings, that really class and occupation become much more pronounced. But there's just not enough evidence to find out if this is actually what's happening in the African context. Most of the studies on this have been focused on three countries: Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. And they typically find that, like in the US, rural migrants tend to settle in particular areas of a city, and you still may have that same segmentation across ethnicity or linguistic groups that we also have here in the States. And so some work by Noah Nathan at Harvard, he's found that actually ethnicity is really playing a strong role still in voting behavior, at least in Accra, even in middle class or upper class neighborhoods. So again, still kind of an area that needs more investigation, and in different countries besides the three that have been looked at so far. The second element of the kind of democratization issue is on collective action. We all know that cities have always been kind of the main locus of kind of contention. This was where our nationalist struggles emerged from in the 50s and 60s. This is where many of our pro-democracy protests were in the 80s and 90s. With the food price crisis in 2007 to 2009, we saw many food riots breaking out in urban centers. And more recently, we're seeing a lot of protests over kind of service delivery or governance issues. And we are, as Tom Goodfellow is finding actually informal organizations, associations of informal workers leading some of these protests now. So one example that he offers are these boda drivers, motorcycle drivers, informal motorcycle drivers in Kampala in Uganda, leading some major protests against the government in recent years. Notably, over the last 20 years, at least some research is suggesting that the kind of locus of conflict, civil conflict in Africa is actually shifting from rural to urban areas. And there's a few different reasons for that. One is the rise in gangs in urban areas. The other is kind of the rise of vigilante justice. If you think of like your Bakassa boys in Nigeria who kind of distrust the police and kind of engage in their own form of vigilante justice, but also greater mobilization of youth leagues and party cadres who engage in electoral violence around elections. A third aspect we can look at regarding democratization is how politicians are responding to some of these dynamics. Over the last decade, we talk about populism in this country and in Europe, Latin America as well. And we've also had a share of populist leaders in Africa, very different than what we see in the US and Europe, but more of what you would see in Latin America. And they're really kind of mobilizing grievances over inequality. So three or four kind of good examples here. Well, the quintessential example is King Cobra and Michael Sata from Zambia. Of course, we have also Julius Malema, the economic freedom fighters in South Africa. His nickname is Juju. Jacob Zuma, South Africa. And then also, I think Raila Odinga fits this categorization as well. And what are kind of the characteristics of populist leaders? Well, I mean, there's a lot has been written on this conceptualization, but in the African context, at least three characteristics seem really salient. One is this perception that are created by these politicians that they have kind of direct ties with the poor, that don't need to be mediated by a party structure. And so very much these are, not surprisingly, these individuals have created, at least these three here, created their own political parties. They have this often kind of paternalistic relationship with citizens that is pronounced by their kind of charisma and their preference for sometimes for anti-intellectualism, so kind of denigrating the elite. It's also emphasized by a second characteristic here, these kind of sociocultural performances. So Michael Sata showing up to the High Court to register, I think it was in 2008, in a speedboat. You know, to kind of, because his campaign symbol was a boat, saying everyone should jump on the boat with me. Of course, Julius Malema, you know, wearing the Hugo Chavez beret, having all his party members come into parliament wearing their janitor uniforms or nanny outfits to show that they're part of the working class. And then the final element is this kind of ideological discourse of us versus them, the elite versus what's called the pure people, the people who've been marginalized, whose voices have been marginalized. And many of them, because it is a really key constituency, as I mentioned earlier, many of them try to focus explicitly on the youth, you know, often hiring very popular kwaito or rap star singers to kind of design their campaign jingles, or campaigning like Jacob Zuma did in bride and ride parties near car washes in the South African townships. So that was kind of on the decentralization. Now let's kind of turn to what these different dynamics on urbanization and democratization, if we add this additional layer of decentralization. And I mean, we know decentralization is really not implemented to its full extent in many countries in the region, but about 27 or so in their national development plans stress decentralization as a priority and have kind of, you know, pursued it to different degrees. And so with urbanization, you know, cities are becoming major sources of power and wealth, also sources of cultural significance as well. But decentralization kind of reduces the power and influence that national governments feasibly have in these settings. And so that's very difficult for national governments to kind of potentially cede away control over some of their most important areas. When we have democratization and when that intersects with decentralization, you have greater potential for what are called vertically divided cities. So where you have the opposition party in control of the city, even as you have a different political party in control at the national level. We've seen this a lot over the past decade or so. If you think of Dakar, if you think of Nairobi, Kampala for a while, and Addis before the EPRDF removed the opposition mayor. And one of the reasons for this is because if you look at any voting data, or if you look at Afrobarometer data, you see that opposition parties drive a majority of their support from urban areas. Urban areas are typically where opposition parties first get their start on the national scene. There are some institutional differences that make the rise of vertically divided authority more pronounced in some contexts than others. And that might make the kind of contention between the local and national government greater in some contexts than others. So on the political front, some of the institutional issues are whether you actually have elections at the subnational level or whether you have appointments. Excuse me. So Ghana, for example, the president appoints the mayors of the cities or of the districts. So you don't really have this vertically divided authority because the president always appoints from his same party, versus elections where the people can actually directly elect the mayor, or they elect the councilors who elect the mayor. Another distinction that I haven't put up here is whether mayors can serve multiple roles at once. This is really distinct in some of our Francophone countries, and a country like Senegal, where the mayor can also serve as a legislator as well. So it's a real kind of accountability issue, but you can have people serving as mayor and serving in the National Assembly. Whether you can have a party versus a candidate. So some places kind of say you have to compete on a partisan ticket. That sometimes makes this issue of vertically divided authority even more pronounced, because you have a kind of whole party machine operating at the local level. In other contexts, again, like Ghana, you can't compete on a party ticket. You have to just compete as an individual. And then whether mayors serve a ceremonial or an executive role. If you have an executive role, you're much more of a threat because you have some autonomy and authority over policy directives, versus if you're kind of ceremonial and you don't really have that same role. So we see some Anglophone countries have more of this kind of ceremonial role for their mayors, like Malawi, like the town clerk will be more important than the mayor. And I think it was the same in Zambia until the recent constitution. On the financial front, if you have kind of rules governing fiscal decentralization, if you have actually a formula that determines how the central government should be allocating resources to the local government, that tends to mitigate ad hoc decisions by the central government. So in places where you don't have these kind of rules for fiscal allocation and the central government can decide year to year how much to allocate to the local government, this tension of vertically divided authority can be more pronounced. Cities, as I just alluded to, they really kind of served as an important political springboard for opposition parties. And I've just talked about a few up here. One is the Democratic Alliance in South Africa, which has kind of more or less controlled Cape Town since 2000. They made important inroads in the 2016 local elections. So you can see the blue is the DA's vote share. So moving into Port Elizabeth, and importantly up to Gauteng province, where of course the important cities of Pretoria and Johannesburg are. And they really use their kind of reputation for service delivery in Cape Town as one of the main examples for how they could improve services in some of these other urban locales. The Patriotic Front, Michael Satta's party, made some important gains in urban areas in 2006 and 2008, actually taking over control of the councils in important urban areas in 2008, such as Lusaka, Ndola, Kitwe on the Copperbelt. And that really started to give it a lot of legitimacy, to give it that kind of final push in winning the presidency in 2011. The Action Congress of Nigeria, or now the kind of All Progressive Congress, ruled Lagos in the opposition from 2006 until 2015 when the party won the national elections. And there also the kind of government of Babatunde Fashola, some of his achievements in delivering services in Lagos were kind of seen as one of the examples that Buhari and other members of the APC showcased in the 2015 elections. And then a kind of smaller example is the MDM. This is kind of the small third party in Mozambique. Davi Simango seemed to have kind of competently ruled as mayor of the city of Beira in opposition since 2013, and was really able to get a significant share of votes, particularly in Maputo and Beira in the subsequent presidential elections. So in some ways, this kind of vertically divided authority it's contentious precisely because national governments kind of fear that these opposition parties can be using it to get into the national political scene. One interesting note is that you see few African mayors or governors becoming presidents in the same way that you see in Latin America and in places like North America. So there's kind of two exceptions I can think of. Maybe you can think of some others. First, you have Macky Sall, the current Senegalese president. But remember, Senegal has that what they call the accumulation of mandates. So he has served as the mayor of Fatick, a town in Senegal, and he served as the prime minister in the Abdoulaye Wade government. And I think it's that kind of recognition he got serving on the national front that really helped him get the national votes that he needed in the last election. We also have Marc Ravalomanana, who's the former president of Madagascar, and he was previously the mayor of Antananarivo. His is just more, I think, a rags to riches story of being quite poor, becoming this amazing dairy tycoon, having his own wealth to travel the country, and winning the national elections before being ousted by the next mayor of Antananarivo. And so what you sometimes see, and I've already started alluding to this, is these strategies of subversion that you see the central governments in these contexts of vertically divided authority pursuing. Sometimes these have negative consequences. Sometimes they actually have unintended positive consequences for the metropolitan or municipal government. So one example is, it's particularly, as I mentioned, in the cases where you don't have clear rules for intergovernmental transfers, the central government may eliminate or reduce these transfers to opposition strongholds. We saw this happening in Lagos under the Action Congress, and also in Beira under the MDM. Particularly in Lagos, this actually energized the governor, and he really invested in mobilizing greater tax revenue from Lagosians. And so, this is kind of a sign that you would see over a bridge in Lagos. It's a criminal offense not to pay your tax. You see many of these signs around Lagos. Many have written about how much revenue had been increased under the tenure of the previous governor, and attributed to actually these intergovernmental transfers being reduced. In other ways, the government influence on the fiscal front can have negative consequences. One is with regards to borrowing in the international market. In the international market. As you know, many national governments are kind of borrowing more on the sovereign debt market using Eurobonds. Some cities are now looking into using municipal bonds to gain more finance. South African cities have been doing this for a while. Just, I think it was about 2 years ago, Dakar was on the cusp of getting its first municipal bond. Everything had gone through with the donors. Khalifa Sall, the mayor, was just about to announce this bond, and then it was told by the national government that this was illegal, and it couldn't be launched. And many have suspected that it's because Khalifa Sall is considered a competitor to Macky Sall, and so he was kind of thwarted in terms of having this amazing launch of a municipal bond. Another way you see these strategies of subversion manifesting, and this is actually much more subversive, is the kind of slow de facto centralization of functions that have been de jure decentralized to local government. You see this with kind of national executives or national ministries interfering in functions that are actually the exclusive mandate of local governments. So to give an example, in Zambia, the councils are actually in control of, constitutionally, of managing markets, managing bus stations, managing things like street hawkers or street vending. But you consistently will see the Ministry of Local Government interfering and telling these local councils, don't harass these individuals, hold back on taking some of the taxes from these individuals. Similarly in Kampala, Yoweri Museveni kind of basically undermined the authority of the previous opposition-led mayor, who's actually pictured here. He was from the FDC party, and a major source of revenue in Kampala was these taxes that were taken from boda motorcyclists. And Yoweri Museveni, in a campaign promise, said he would stop taxation of these motorcyclists, effectively taking away a major source of revenue for the local government. And Uganda actually gives us a case of a more explicit way of subversion, where you just outright reduce the influence of elected mayors, and basically undermining political decentralization. So, Museveni removed this mayor of Kampala, Arias Lukwago, and created an executive director who is appointed now, who leads the Kampala Capital City Authority, and he's basically made Lukwago a ceremonial mayor, whose actual mandate over any kind of policy making has been severely reduced. So just to conclude here, I hope that I've kind of made the point that urbanization is an unstoppable force in Africa. And this has really been highlighted in a number of policy domains, particularly the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They've made inclusive sustainable cities as one of their SDGs. The UN now has its new urban agenda. And the African Union has also bought into the importance of urbanization and creating kind of healthy, resilient cities. And you can see that in the AU's Africa 2063 agenda. Of course, all these processes are really creating new areas of policy urgency. They may question kind of traditional sociocultural identities, but as I said, that's an area for further investigation. And when you kind of layer on top of these processes democratization trends and decentralization trends, where you have opposition parties more likely to be governing cities, mundane services like collecting the trash or cleaning litter out of the sewers actually become intensely politically contested services. There's many research gaps in this area, and I think one thing that's really missing and maybe can be kind of taken on by any of you thinking about thesis topics, but really doing some more kind of comparative cross-city research that really is quite methodologically rigorous, takes into account some of the issues and variations and definitions of urban, the service delivery constraints, the institutional differences across these countries, and can start investigating a little bit more the kind of politics of service delivery in urban Africa. So I'm going to leave it there and take some questions.
Thank you very much.
I've had the fortune of traveling to Zambia a number of times recently because of my friendship with Muna, I think. In 2016, when Zambia had the election crisis, a lot of the initial rioting was in rural areas that got very little coverage. And then that spread over time into Lusaka and also into the Copper Belt. And then when HH was finally accused of treason, that also happened because of something in a rural area. And I'm just kind of wondering what your sense is about lack of coverage in rural locations that then would be misunderstood in the capital areas, and whether that's a real ongoing problem or not.
Do you respond or yeah? Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that's been kind of talked about a little bit in people who use kind of media studies of things like, because most of our conflict data is actually from media reports. And I do think that's a great point, that it's probably very much underreported in rural areas, these dynamics. And so this urban bias that we're seeing in terms of the shift of conflict, for example, could be maybe skewed by the media underreporting. What you're saying also is interesting in terms of potentially looking more into these linkages, these rural-urban linkages between communities in terms of issues that are of residents in rural areas, and then how they may, resonate with urbanites and kind of lead to the rioting or the conflagration that we saw in the Lusaka context. But that's very interesting. I didn't know that backstory. So thanks for sharing that with me.
Comments, questions?
Yeah.
Yes. So during this series, just in general, in terms of the Africa growth story and how economic expansion is going to come in Africa, we're always told that it's going to come in a different way than it came like the West or East Asia, and like how the Africa growth story is going to have one part of it. From what I've seen, like urbanization has like led to like you said, like these are independent economies and independent like nation states within countries that often like function better. Like in your opinion, in terms of like looking at economic growth and like a future of better governance, like do you think urbanization can play a key role in that, and that it's often in response to like a dysfunctional government, like you talked about Lagos and how it's like its own tax system and it's even removing itself from the power grid. Like, do you think more of that? Like, I guess less dependence on what has thus far been dysfunctional governments in a lot of places is going to play a key role in moving forward? Do you think that mass movement into urban areas is just kind of like mostly like present to either infrastructural problems or service delivery problems?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the future holds, but I do think we have seen, like the Lagos story, but also, I mean, South Africa is an interesting project that's been out of the Africa Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and it's looking at turning African cities around. So cities that were kind of like Lagos, but also Johannesburg, that people kind of gave up on, how kind of in periods of crisis they were able to turn around. So like in Johannesburg, basically, the city kind of going into debt and going into administration, and then how they were able to turn that around. So I think, if you do have capable leaders, and that's one of their conclusions, is when you have leaders with a vision, and to have a kind of cadre of technocrats who can support them, you may be getting some of this turnaround from the chaos. I do think I think most of the economic growth we do see in Africa is very much urban skewed. I mean, this is where a lot of investors put their money. Even a lot of, as I said, I work mostly in agriculture. You see a lot of agro processing being concentrated, not directly in the city center, but actually in the peri-urban areas, where you're kind of mediating between agricultural producers and then the retailers upstream. So I do think urban areas will certainly, and they have been, these will be the centers for growth. And I think that is why they are so contested, because you see the growth, you see the wealth, and you still see the poverty and inequality at the same time.
A comment is that my job takes me often to Albany, and if anyone travels to New York City would have noticed that the New York City police are now patrolling the highways, because these problems are the same in America. The governor and the mayor don't like each other.
Yeah.
So the governor has now put the state police back after decades of not being there, patrolling the New York City highways.
Yeah.
To deprive the mayor of New York City of the costs the funds that are coming in through charging speeding tickets and so forth. So those problems happen everywhere. Yes,
this is very true. I think it's just that because of the democratization trend being relatively recent in Africa, it's becoming this problem of vertically divided authority has become more pronounced there. But you're right. In Latin America, you can see many cases of this issue between particularly governors and the presidents as well. Yeah.
In terms of the growth of new cities, like you pointed out, that I was trying to plan something. I've read some literature that would suggest that many of the African cities are not new. The growth is around the really close settlements. In Nairobi, where you're looking at Lusaka, they're not new cities. These are all
colonial
pre-independent cities, and they're just growing. So there's not really any new city development. Maybe Tanzania with
Dodoma. Dodoma.
Habaroni is pretty much post-independence.
Yeah.
But it was there as a settlement. I know, but what I'm saying is that there's no completely new area. It's like growing around. Yeah, whereas Dodoma, an example of something which was not there, sort of like start a new city.
Or Abuja.
Yeah, but the others. So.
Abuja or Yamoussoukro or some of the I think that's a good point. I was thinking about whether any research can be done on these concerted efforts by governments to change their capital city location, and how that has that reduced pressure on service delivery, or has it kind of my feeling is that it's kind of just creating a new, you're kind of ignoring what's been going on in these cities, and let's try to start fresh. But you see that globally too. Like Brasilia or Myanmar has this pretty cold new capital of 14-lane highways and huge buildings where no one's living there. So I think this strategy of kind of spatial disaggregation and getting away from primacy, it'd be interesting to look over time about how that's affected revenues and service delivery.
Could you say something more about the crackdowns or the suppression of the informal sector in cities, and what the, I mean, I have two things, kind of what the political strategy
Mhm.
involved in that is, and this is, I noticed the pictures you had all seem to be of men.
Mhm. Mhm.
Is there a gender distinction? Do they crack down on male
Mhm.
craftsmen and traders more than the women food traders? I mean, who are still so basic to
Mhm.
the urban economy.
Yeah, no, thanks for those questions. Yeah, that, I mean, that was probably just, random sampling of
Right.
pictures. Because yes, I mean, actually women make up the greater share of the informal economy and are more involved particularly in the food sector. I think because of that though, and I've been doing some surveys in different countries on that, I mean, their earnings are much less than the men who are more in the processed sector. Or involved in hardware or other. So I think that in some ways that does make them a little bit more of a target in terms of confiscation, because you have to pay a fee often to get your things back. And in places like Ghana, I found out, the fee you pay is based on the value of your goods. So you can make more money in a way by targeting those who are selling. Yeah, yeah. And I've seen in tracking some stories that, of course, a little bit more sympathy is engendered when you're cracking down on women. Particularly, there's been cases, where they have baby on their back, and it's seen as being more inhumane in some way than cracking down on the men. But I don't know statistically if there's more crackdowns by gender. The political strategy. I've looked at this a little bit. I mean, I think that there's two important things here. One is the real kind of autonomy that local governments have over vending. Is this something that they have exclusive authority on, or is this problem of kind of what we call fuzzy urban governance, where both layers of government can be involved? So like a place like Ghana is really well known for its decongestion campaigns. So this is the euphemism for cracking down on the informal sector. And when you look over time, that doesn't vary by political party. And it's because I think the local governments they can make their own bylaws over vending. There's very little national government interference. And as I mentioned before, there's not this problem of vertically divided authority because they appoint the mayors. So it's not really used as a strategy to either punish urban citizens who are supporting the opposition party, or as a way to, I mean, in Dakar, you've seen the opposite, where Khalifa Sall, actually under his tenure, there's been a lot of crackdowns. Actually, Senegal has had a lot of crackdowns on the informal sector. And the national government has tried in some ways to co-opt the informal sector and, create different associations and saying, well, we would, if the Khalifa Sall government is not catering to the needs of the poor, then the national government will. So those dynamics can play out both ways when you have that vertically divided authority. I think it depends also on where the source of votes are for the party as well, who they see as their main constituency. Sall has very much seen the middle class, Dakarois, being his constituency, and he's been rewarded by getting vendors off the streets, paving the roads, and moving the vendors into peripheral markets. And so he was really reelected in the local elections with quite high margins. So,
Continuation of colonial.
yeah, oh yeah. It's the same strategy that's been used. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Yes.
I was taken by your comments about the more charismatic leaders coming out in Kama. And I know that Michael Sada's father, like Guy Scott, his vice president's father, were both part of the Kunda administration, or they were friends with Kunda. I can't remember exactly. So, do you see those movements as organic new things? I don't know anything about Zambia, so. Or are these sort of conservative movements that are wedded more to the past, and look back toward the past? What do you vary?
I think it's more, when I look at some of the populists, a big distinction between kind of African and Latin American populists is kind of Latin American populists are kind of they're legitimately outsiders who've come into politics. And many of your African populists have been in politics for a long time. So Sata was also in Kayonda's government under UNUP, and he's been in every government, MMD, and then created the Patriotic Front as well. You can see that with some of the other populists. I mean, Malema, of course, was in the ANC before he began. So they've tried to recreate themselves as they can't claim they're legitimate outsiders, but they kind of claim that they have been outside some of the corruption or some of the malfeasance that occurred under previous administrations in which they were involved. So I think there is actually just as more of a chameleon tactic rather than a kind of some connection with a previous historical regime.
Yeah. Any other questions? The Zimbabwe case is also interesting in the sense of Mugabe's capital on that operation of his, which was rubbish. Even the terms they were using.
Clear the filth.
It was really MDC, I think, that because the cities have become opposition strongholds.
Yeah.
Then they launched this big, massive cleanup with the very derogatory terms, like clear
That's
rubbish. What the constitution?
I can't pronounce it. Murumba China.
Basically, Shona meaning that clear all the rubbish out of the cities.
Yeah.
But in the end, it was clearly, you could see that it was targeting the opposition.
Yeah, because it was in MDC cities where it was targeted.
And the other thing I've noticed in terms of African cities, I think you referred to Kibera, the growth of these, shanties, whether in Ohio or Zambia, that there's a lot of housing construction, but it's always at the higher end, and there is no housing for low income.
Yeah.
You don't see any projects at all that address the new young people coming into jobs and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's like all the expansion is these mega housing projects. So even the private guys they're building big things.
Yeah.
But nobody is building anything.
Yeah.
And then the people didn't start to respond by just getting into this squatter compound.
Right. Yeah. I think that's because most governments can't publicly fund on their own. So most of these housing developments are public-private partnerships or just private sector. And the private sector is not really interested in low-income housing.
There was also a shift in government policy. Because I think the case of Lusaka is very interesting, Zambia, in that the city councils used to build low-income housing for a long time. And then when Kaunda came in, he said, no, they have to stop. Because according to him, the people must be empowered on their own and they must build these houses. So if you look at the old townships, like Ibala, Chilenje, they all built by the city council. But after, I think, the 70s, he prohibited them from doing that.
Okay, I didn't know the history. Yeah, the history. Sorry.
Well, Botswana used to, the government, so do you know if it still does, was building housing.
Okay.
So it had government in the 80s when I lived there. I mean, they had, I don't know, certainly hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses that were called low cost, which were a certain size, and medium cost housing. And then the higher cost was private. But, and you had to get access through the government.
Yeah.
So some expat teaching in the university got that access, but it was mostly for citizens of Botswana who could afford to buy these houses on a certain terms from the government. Now, there were also townships, as they were called by South African visitors, where people built their own little houses. But, and they also had a program where the government would give land and provide materials, concrete blocks, right? And people could build their own little houses. And so those were really low, accessible to low-income urban people. And they did it despite the fact that the opposition party's stronghold was Gaborone.
Yeah, that's true.
So, but I don't know if they're still doing that or
Well, at some point,
not.
this thing of building land and then you put it. There was actually a World Bank project. Yeah, they were called site and service scheme.
Yeah.
The World Bank was the one pushing that idea.
Yeah, the donors.
You find them everywhere. In Zambia, in Uganda. To demarcate plots and then give you basic materials. And the idea was to build this. But then most of those also turned into somewhat shelters because people didn't afford some
to maintain them. Yeah.
Some didn't. So
Yeah.
and I think you also see a difference in terms of mining towns because the mining companies build the houses. So then you have huge
That's right.
low-cost housing.
Yeah. Yeah.
To Kitwe or Dollar, there will be lots of low-cost housing,
Yeah.
which you don't get in the government sort of dominated cities.
That's true.
So there's also I think there's a failure of housing policy. I mean, there's just no housing policy.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point.
I'll have to find out what's what.
I don't know about Botswana. Botswana is unique from Zambia because of its, I think a lot of the trends have been donor driven more to the private sector, and Botswana hasn't had as much donor influence as some of the others.
Any other comments and experiences in Dodoma? How is it doing, Dodoma? We have some visitors from Tanzania today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
In Dodoma.
Growing into
Dodoma has been there as a regional town, but also there are some ministries which shift even before the president decided that now the whole government is moving to Dodoma. So there were some, even the National Assembly was in Dodoma since then. However, still from the other way is young people are moving to town because it's like in the case of Tanzania, we're saying more than 70% depend on agriculture. But due to the climate change and whatever, they can't grow crops in the villages, so they need to look for greener pastures to go and work in urban. Well, they're moving there to urban. The urban is not prepared to receive them. So there's a lot of movement from the rural area to the urban, which I don't think, even if we're having good policies in housing and new cities, if you don't address the rural job and crisis, still we'll end up with the same problems. Much people do move every day to town looking for jobs. Because there's nothing to do with the villages. Once you graduate from school, you can't cultivate, you can't do what, then you have to find a place. Only places that you can go is in town where at least maybe there are industry, you can sell water around, or you can do some informal businesses.
Yeah. This has been a big focus of donor. Being at IFPRI, we get a lot of requests for looking at youth in agriculture, and there's been a number of governments do have those programs, but they've been, in terms of tapping into the aspirations of. It's not just about keeping people in rural areas, but are they doing jobs that, are fulfilling to them? Particularly because, young Africans today are much better educated than previous generations, much better connected. So that challenge of finding youth in agriculture jobs that kind of tap into aspirations as well and don't just keep them in rural areas is a real challenge.